It's high on a mountain, the warm winds are blowing, and where the winds are blowing to, there ain't no way of knowing. The mountain grass is short, it's dry and close to burning, crying out for water as the season's turning. Sweet smell of the pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.
Hello, this is Ayana Young, and I welcome you to Unlearn and Rewild, where we explore radical ideas relating to earth renewal. Today, I am so happy to have Peter McCOY on the show. Peter is a mushroom cultivation instructor and co-founder of the Radical Mycology movement and co-organizer of the Radical Mycology Convergence. Peter has studied mycology for over 13 years, with the focus on the uses of fungi for healing the minds, bodies, and ecosystems of the Earth's inhabitants. He is also the author of the upcoming book, Radical Mycology. Hi, Peter. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on the show.
Great. I'd like if you could start us off by giving us an introduction and definition of radical mycology.
Sure. It's kind of easiest to compare it to, or contrast it perhaps, with traditional mycology, which is what we in the radical mycology movement have kind of grown out of. Traditional mycology is what, if anybody knows anything about mycology, which is the study of fungal biology or kind of the science of fungi, that's more or less rooted in about 100 years of more serious study, although, of course, the history goes back much further. But largely, mycology has traditionally focused in an academic setting, largely around identification of all the different fungi in the world and basically what their role is in the environment and how they kind of operate, their biology, how they grow, basic stuff like that, just picking apart the whole fungus to understand its complexity. But really not much beyond that. If anything, a person might get involved in their local mycological society, which again is sort of rooted in a traditional approach of just understanding fungi as external to us and seeing them for kind of resources and what they can provide for humans as far as especially food and medicine. And mostly people in mycological societies typically spend a lot of their time focusing on hunting mushrooms, whether for identification and just the joy of identification or for food. So radical mycology kind of comes out of that tradition of more individualistic approach to fungi. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people involved in mycological societies and mycological culture are interested in the fungi for the fungi's sake and do really appreciate and care about the fungi and want to understand them and protect them and create greater awareness around them. But where we contrast a bit with that, with radical mycology, is a lot more of our focus is on how fungi have worked with humans in the past and what humans have learned from them historically and allied with them, and how we can learn from the past and also from current understandings and more recent scientific understandings of fungi and even more grassroots understandings of how to work with and cultivate fungi for not only human benefits, which there are many, but also for helping the habitats of the environment, helping the other organisms, helping the planet as a whole, helping the fungi as well survive and better persist. And then beyond that, we like to take the many ways that we can work with fungi and apply the systems theory approach and patterns underlying how the fungi interact in the world and apply that understanding in a metaphoric way to humans and how we can relate to each other and again relate to the rest of the world, the other organisms, in a more symbiotic, interrelated approach. So that's where we take a really big leap, I guess, from traditional mycology, is really being willing to put mycology in a socio-political context and showing how everything is interrelated, everything is important to our survival and for the world's health and functioning, but also being really explicit about that and showing how, just like every other issue in social environmental justice is interrelated with the whole, so is mycology as a science, as a part of the world. We need to talk about this. And the problem is that most people don't know anything about mycology other than maybe to be afraid of mushrooms or something like that. And so it's this huge hurdle we have to get over in discussions to introduce the topic, and then from there even go into what all these possibilities are. So that's sort of a roundabout introduction to the project.
It's such a wonderfully holistic view of the science of mushrooms. I love that it breaks down the old paradigm which really separated us, the average person, from this purely academic study, and opens it up, allowing people to collaborate on so many different facets of the amazing world of mushrooms. And speaking of people connecting to mushrooms, I've often heard it said that a fungus more closely resembles an animal than a plant. Can you help us wrap our heads around that? Do fungi possess any kind of instinct?
Well, yeah, there's a few layers of how I see that relationship. So on a technically scientific approach to how we're related to fungi, through genetic analysis and DNA analysis of the last couple of decades, it's been more or less proven that our genetics are more closely related to the fungal kingdom than to the plant kingdom. So as everything has theoretically evolved over the eons from the earliest bacteria, sometime in the past, about 1.5 million years ago or so, plants branched off and went to do their own thing. And then the sort of whatever the pre-ancestor to animals and fungi branched in their own direction. And then about 750 million years ago, fungi branched off again and went in their own direction, and animals continued in our direction. And so sort of on that basis of the timeline of evolution of how things have evolved, different species have arisen, we are more closely related to fungi. So that's where that concept is largely related to. But on a more literal, tangible level, we do share some structural and physiological similarities. So the fungi also breathe in oxygen and expel CO2. So it's the opposite of plants, but that's the same as what animals and humans do. But they do, so there's those kinds of things. They don't produce their own food. They do not photosynthesize. They have to get all their food from somewhere outside of them, just like we have to. So there's some similarities there. But on a more interesting note, they definitely do seem to have something like intelligence. And so that's a controversial concept, I'm sure, for many people, maybe not for your audience, I'm not sure. But there's been lots of interesting studies done with fungi where different lower fungi, even more simple forms of fungi and slime molds, have been shown to solve mazes quite rapidly, and actually to remember mazes and things like that. They've done designs where they put, one famous example is they put oat flakes distributed in the same distances of the major cities of Japan. And this slime mold essentially encountered all of these oat flakes and developed streams of connecting sort of pseudo mycelium, if you will. They're not true fungi, but connected these oat flakes essentially in the same branching pattern as the metro system, as the subway system. Wow. And it actually did it more effectively and more efficiently than the Japanese engineers had designed it. So that was pretty impressive. But then even the higher fungi definitely have an incredible response to human interaction. I mean, time and time again, you learn about how they're the first responders to erosion, to burns. They're the first things to come on the scene after a lava flow to restore soil and to bring in the foundations of all the life forms that follow. They're fundamental to the channeling of nutrients between plants and ecosystems and really maintaining the health of an ecosystem. And arguably, they are sort of this brains of the ecosystem, if you will. Arguably, again, intelligently rather, distributing nutrients where needed to plants that are deficient in nutrients. So a good example is the sapling trees that don't get any sunlight at the bottom of the forest that should normally die because they rely on direct sunlight have been shown to be fed by other parent trees, larger trees nearby through a mycelial network, feeding the trees. And you can argue about what the evolutionary advantages to those organisms and why the fungi would go out of its way essentially to do that. But, one angle that I like to look at it, where we take it with the radical mycology thing, is it's thinking beyond itself and its immediate needs to the larger health of the whole ecosystem. Yes, to its spores and its later generations, if you want to think about it like that. But I like to think about it that it's actually just thinking holistically, that everything is important. And if all these plants died, then nothing would live. Mm. So these are some of the lessons we can learn from just observing the fungi and seeing how our actions can mimic and do mimic the way that they interact beyond just the physical similarities that we have.
So when you were just describing the mycelium being the brain of an ecosystem, is that why people refer to the mycelial network as the internet of the natural world? Because when you were speaking of the mycelium transferring nutrients from the larger trees to the saplings, That's an example of spreading information, right? So, what other information can the mycelium spread through the ecosystem?
So that concept is where the idea of fungi being the Earth's internet has come from. And not only that, the structure of the mycelial networks mimics the structure of the dendrites, the neurons in our brain, dark matter throughout the universe, the microtubule structure in our cells, which information within our cells, vacuoles and things is exchanged even on the cellular level, and then as well to the internet structure. So there's just structural similarities. These kind of fractaline structures are similar. But yeah, there is information exchange to some degree. So what kind of information are we talking about? I mean, a scientist would tell you it boils down to carbon and nitrogen and minerals and things like that. And that's all that's going on. But, depending on the person, you might be willing to accept that if there is some sort of other form of intelligence that the fungus has, that it's communicating with the plants and exchanging again based on the needs of this plant. There's some sort of communication going on, whether it's pure chemical signaling or something that's yet to be detected or understood. I think it's all very fascinating. The other information that could be there, I mean, it's so incredibly complex. I've been reading a really great book called Mycorrhizal Symbiosis, which is kind of one of the better books out there. The third edition came out a few years ago. It's really up to date and just kind of mind blowing, but showing time and time again that so much of mycorrhizal fungi is just not understood, and that the complexity of these relationships is so dynamic. It's not just one fungus to one tree. It's multiple fungi connecting multiple species all together in a woven matrix with bacteria and other unicellular organisms in the environment interacting with the fungi. The bacteria as well influence whether or not the spores of the mycorrhizal fungus will grow. And so it's all so dynamic that we can't look at this in a reductionist way of breaking it apart. And yes, there's all kinds of information. It kind of just depends on what you mean by information. What is actually happening? And I think the simplest way to put that is the fungi, again, is just maintaining the health of the environment. I mean, they're fundamental. Without the fungus, whole ecosystems would collapse. Not only because they break down the nutrients, return them to the soil, but then again, because they distribute them and seem to sort of manage the forest in a hidden way.
I'd also like to touch on a subject you mentioned earlier when defining radical mycology, which is its relationship to social and environmental justice. I would love to hear your current thinking on activism and where to put our energy and how to balance localized renewal and wider leadership efforts.
It's a big question. Well, it's far from me to tell any one person what to do or to prescribe, what's going to start the revolution. But I mean, I definitely think I'd have found, first of all, that I and anybody else in the world should only follow their calling and what they're most passionate about. And I think that that's really ultimately what's going to lead to fundamental change, is people living out their greatest ambitions. And that's going to lead to a more positive world and hopefully positive change. And I think one of the greatest things that's holds us back is people, for a variety of reasons. That's a whole other discussion. They're unable to live out their goals or their dreams. So with that being said, I do think one of the bigger things that we try to add to the discussion around environmental and social justice movements and things of that nature in general through radical mycology is, again, this metaphoric concept of symbiosis, of co-collaboration, of coalition building between organizations. And that one of the things that I've experienced in my history of doing social and environmental justice work in the past is at times, I mean, depending on the people in the organization, of course, it's so variable, but it's sometimes hard to build those bridges between people that might have, on the surface, seemingly very different political views or different analyses or different just perspectives on the world, or backgrounds or things like that keep us sort of separated from each other. And that's, one of the worst things. That's how the system keeps us divided, is we stay divided. We keep ourselves divided. And so, what we talk a lot about through the Radical Mycology thing is trying as best we can to find ways to look past our differences and to find these forms of symbiosis on a whole spectrum. So there, again, in the fungal kingdom, there's a range of mutualism to parasitism. So are we doing mutual aid, or are we hurting each other? And that can happen in the activist community. We can be hurting each other and fighting each other, and that doesn't serve any cause. I feel like we need to tend more towards the mutualistic aid in all respects. I mean, there's always going to be differences. There's always going to be those dramas, but that's never going to make the systemic whole global change that, I think a lot of us want to see. And so that's kind of another underlying cause, not really exact prescription, but just some food for thought that I like to keep in the back of my head with whatever I do. But then beyond that, I mean, what we try to do through the radical mycology thing is not to say that our solution or mycology in general, I think that is going to save the world or change things or is the ultimate solution. What we're trying to offer is a new tool for the toolbox for people that are looking for new alternatives, and to show that this thing, mycology, fungus, something that most people in the West have been told to fear or to ignore, or have never learned anything about in their whole life, is actually incredibly fascinating and important. Mycology maybe is your first step into questioning everything you've been told and to trying to really think in totally different ways and to create truly different paradigms and truly different perspectives and approaches to the world. I think one of the greatest things that holds us back is when people try to just fight the system as it is or try to reform it and try to shift it and change it slowly or subtly from within. And I can understand that perspective, and I've heard those perspectives many times. But for me, I think about the Buckminster Fuller quote, which is something to the effect that you never really change the system by fighting it. You must create something wholly alternative so that replaces the outdated older system. And so that's not to devalue direct action or things like that. But what I'm saying is, in my perspective, that we just need fully different ways of looking at things, fully different ways of conceptualizing how human societies can be, and really trying to create those alternatives. And that's definitely a historical approach that has come through a lot of environmental and social justice work, don't get me wrong. People creating alternative systems and ways to drop out of the economic system and things, or create alternative economic systems. I think that's really important. But just taking that a step further, and I mean, a lot of the same tactics that were developed in, the late 90s, early 2000s are still being applied. And, I'm always just looking for and hoping for something radical new to inspire me. Mycology is the one thing that I can bring to the table that, we and the people I work with, we all realize that we know something that most people don't. So we focus our energy on sharing it because we feel passionate about it. But definitely there's so much more that could be explored and so many more options out there that have yet to really be tested and to be brought to the forefront. I can't prescribe anything beyond that, but just encouraging people to think differently.
There's a fire in the forest. It's taking down some trees. When things are overwhelming, I let them be. I would like to see you. It's lovely to see you. Come and take me somewhere. Come take me out. There is always sunshine far above the gray sky. I know that I will find it. Yes, I will try.
What is mycoforestry? How does it work? And what is its potential, whether it's used in replanting degraded landscapes or helping to break down toxins from industrial disasters?
Yeah, definitely. A big part of where the Radical Mycology project really started was trying to share a greater understanding of mushroom cultivation, growing mushrooms, but with a strong emphasis on working with fungi to restore and help heal damaged environments. And there's several different terms that float around that concept of mycoforestry is one, myco-restoration, myco-remediation or fungal remediation. Or bioremediation is just a bigger umbrella term for these kind of concepts where myco, meaning you're focusing on fungi, but bio brings in bacteria and plants. And so that was definitely one of the underlying emphasis behind the whole Radical Mycology project where we started, and definitely a thing that keeps us going. And I think there's a lot of potential with bringing the fungi, again, encouraging their growth, helping support their growth, bringing them back into damaged environments, reintroducing species, things of this nature, just like you would rehabilitate with plants. But I think, first of all, for me, you always say that before we can even think about healing these problems, we have to think about the underlying issues and where they even started. So, of course, that gets into bigger picture issues of, who's cutting the wood and why, and where is it going, and do we need to cut it, and things of this nature, and what is the system that's supporting these clear cuts and this environmental destruction and all these things that are just completely aggravating for me. But with that sort of put aside, the potential for fungi to help restore a damaged environment, whether it was human caused or natural cause, is pretty diverse. On the simplest level, one of the things you'll read about is using fungi to first restore the topsoil of a denuded land. So you take the slash or whatever wood waste is left over and inoculate it with some sort of fast-growing, decomposing fungus that will turn that wood quickly into humus and topsoil in just a few years, as opposed to a few decades, which it would take in naturally without being inoculated. And I think that that's really interesting, but it's only going to last for so long. I mean, if that land is not planted with trees, that topsoil is just going to dry out and blow away. You can also bring in mycorrhizal fungi, so you can inoculate the trees that you plant. And again, you'll be establishing those mycorrhizal networks, those mycelial networks below the ground that connect different plants together through a fungal network where nutrients are exchanged and the plants are better able to survive. So intentional inoculation of trees and other shrubs and plants is incredibly important to helping restore a damaged environment. And you can also, if the environment has been destroyed by or damaged by some form of pollution, whether it's tailings ponds or coal mining or an abandoned mine or anything of that nature, you can definitely implement different efforts to remediate and to mitigate and reduce the pollution contaminants. But I definitely never try to paint this silver bullet picture that fungi can just save these environments. I think that's sort of a common misconception that you can just throw this thing out there and it's an easy, quick solution and a Band-Aid for this incredible problem, this incredible systemic problem that really needs to be addressed again on the underlying level. So we can apply fungi in numerous ways to try to clean up the pollution, to try to collect the heavy metals that are coming out of a tailings pond or an abandoned mine. And there's different strategies to remediate them, and I'd be happy to go into that. But we just need to think bigger picture, that first of all, we can't, the term myco-restoration is sort of a misnomer, because we'll never restore the environment back to how it was. We can regenerate it, we can try to help it come back and survive and be healthy again, but it'll never be what it was. And so people need to get over this concept that fungi can just magically change the world. Don't get me wrong, I mean, I think fungi are incredible, but we sort of externalize the problems that we as humans have caused and kind of put it onto the backs of the mycelium and say, well, you take care of it. And that's not a fair approach. And it doesn't really help us think in a bigger picture too, or even develop good strategies. So beyond just using fungi, going back to the bigger picture of bioremediation, we need to think about, if we're healing an environment, what was existing there before. It wasn't just a fungus growing through dead wood like we're trying to create. I mean, there were plants, there were bacteria, there was an incredible ecosystem above and below ground, and that's what we hopefully want to help reintroduce over time. And so in bioremediation strategies, you're much better suited to introduce beneficial bacteria and plants along with fungi to create a whole systems approach and a more holistic approach, and really understanding nature and trying to mimic it, and not try to come in again with the silver bullet approach that we as humans know what's better for nature and that we know what's right. I think another big component to this is just going in with a bit of respect and awe, and maybe observing for a while and seeing what plants have already started to come back, and see what fungi have started to come back after this clear cutting or whatever's happened. Because those are your pioneer species. Those are the ones that are best suited to rehabilitate this land. And so those are the ones you might want to work with first, and then in sequence and over time, and you develop a relationship with this land. You don't just come in, throw down some mycelium and walk away and think that you've solved the problem. It's too simplistic and short-sighted. So, I mean, I'm not trying to be a downer. I just want to always paint this clear picture of what are we actually doing when we try to restore a habitat, and to think realistically and honestly with ourselves and with each other and with the fungi and with the whole world, and try to develop a relationship of understanding so that we can come to the best solutions that hopefully helps everybody.
Well, considering the overwhelming disaster from the breakdown of Fukushima power plant in Japan, I've heard about certain species of hyperaccumulating fungi that can concentrate radioactive isotopes, such as Gomphidius glutinosus or the slimy spikecap, which can concentrate radioactive cesium-137 10,000 times over background levels. Another is the winter chanterelle, which is common in the Pacific Northwest. Shortly after the Fukushima meltdown, Paul Statements published a plan of action to chip all the scrap wood left by the tsunami and mulch the area around the reactors, then to inoculate the mulch with fungal species that would accumulate the radioactive particles. The mushrooms that resulted would be harvested and dealt with, and then he also proposed reforesting the entire area and creating a park that would never be logged, and the trees would encapsulate the radioactivity in their trunks. So do you think that some or all of this plan could come to pass? And considering how much radioactive waste has been dumped into the Pacific Ocean since Fukushima, is there a micro-remediation technique that deals with the contamination of freshwater aquifers and oceans?
Yeah, this is definitely a great question that, I never want to act like I have the final solution or anything like that. But yeah, again, I think the Stamets approach with the Gomphidius glutinosus is a great idea, and I think it's kind of the best relatively low tech and manageable and potential response using fungi. Now, again, what other plants could be involved that could also accumulate some of these metals and things like that is a bigger question. But as far as this system, again, we just have to think about it kind of long term and bigger picture. What's actually going to happen? Well, what's ultimately going to happen is if this plan was enacted, the chips would get laid down. It's this incredibly large area of land. I don't even know the diameter, miles and miles wide area. That's the immediate zone, let alone everything else. And the mycelium, may or may not establish healthily throughout all these chips. There's a lot of competition that's already pre-existing, and who knows, nature is so dynamic. You never know what's really going to happen doing outdoor installations like this to a certain degree. But let's say even the whole thing got inoculated and went off without a hitch. It would take some time for the mycelium to establish. Then it has to penetrate down into the soil, and it basically scavenging the soil beneath these wood chips for metal, for these radioactive isotopes. And then what happens is that the mycelium brings in those isotopes through its mycelium, into its structure, channels it through the whole network, and it ultimately pushes it out up into the fruit body of the mushroom that comes above ground. And so what that means is that generations of Japanese people will have to travel this incredibly large area every fall or every season that the mushroom is fruiting, wearing radioactive gear, and harvest these mushrooms and then dispose of them, because the radiation doesn't go away. It's just concentrated into the mushrooms. These are metals, these are elements that can't be further broken down, and they'll remain radioactive inside the mushroom. So you're holding a hot radioactive mushroom in your hand. And so they have to be collected and then disposed of properly, just like you dispose of other toxic waste, which is, again, another huge topic unto itself. So that's the realistic feasibility behind this. There's just generations of people harvesting for unknown numbers of years. And who's to say if all of the metal will be accumulated into the mushrooms and will be actually harvested out, and who knows how long it will actually take for that land to ever be restored again, if ever, through fungi alone. And even with other plants and things brought in, it's really hard to say if it'll ever be back anything close to what it was before. But it is sort of a really good approach, and I do respect that idea and that proposal. I just don't know how feasible it is in the long run. But perhaps, there's a lot of money going into this restoration, supposedly. As far as on the West Coast, where I am, there's definitely a huge concern that a lot of people have, but it's not really covered in the media so much. There's pollution washing up all the time. Trying to clean the whole ocean, I think, is, I don't want to say impossible, but it's a big one. And
yeah.
There's radioactive metal isotopes, tiny elements sprinkled throughout the entire Pacific Ocean and traveling the whole world now. So that's our future reality, and that's the reality of our children in 7 generations. So, but what can we do on the land and on the shorelines and things like that? We can take a similar approach and try to accumulate some of these metals as they wash up using similar fungi. But I mean, again, the percentage of what we might be accumulating and then ultimately harvesting, and even if it accumulates just in the mycelium, let's say we have burlap sacks filled with wood chips with the Gymphidius glutinosus on the shorelines all across the western shoreboard. And over the years, they're accumulating these metals, and it's just magically working perfect. Then we have to gather all this mycelium that's radioactive now, and the visitors to the shore can't touch these bags, and they have to be disposed of. It's like, what's the realistic nature of this? And then again, a lot of this radioactive cesium came by air currents. It was lifted up and floated over the ocean and landed on the shore and just deposits on the soil. And last year, I saw a presentation from an amateur mycologist who basically gathered chanterelles all up and down the West Coast. He had mycological societies send him dried specimens, and he had access to a lab and tested them all for radioactive cesium concentrations to see if these edible mushrooms that everybody picks on the West Coast, if they were radioactive. And kind of the punchline was, sure enough, they were above background levels, and they were more radioactive, but they were technically safe to eat by FDA standards. I don't want to eat radiation. Everything supposedly is emitting radiation to some degree, so there's that whole concept. But it is such a huge concept, and I have never really heard, as far as the radiation issue, Fukushima, there is no easy answer with bioremediation. You can try to accumulate these metals, but the microorganisms cannot speed up the decay of these elements. So you're still going to have to dispose of them, and it's all a very tricky business.
So, considering that Fukushima fallout is present and increasing in the Northwest and really all over the world, are there any edible mushrooms that should be regarded with caution as hyperaccumulators? And are there any that are safer to consume? You were describing the study with the chanterelles, that they were in fact accumulating radiation, but they were also still considered safe to eat under the FDA standards.
That's another really great question. I wish I had a good answer for it, but as far as which mushrooms accumulate radioactive cesium, I don't think that there's been, as far as I've heard, and I might very well be wrong, but there's not a lot of, I haven't seen the list, I guess, of mushrooms that are known to accumulate cesium, radioactive cesium. And that's not to say that there aren't many out there that do. It's just a matter of what has been tested, how much grant money and funding money has been put into testing, a certain mushroom for a certain metal uptake. I mean, that's a scientific experiment that costs a lot of money and takes a long time to do. And so there's only so many of those that have been done. This one with the chanterelles was kind of this incredible fluke where, again, he was an amateur, and it was a very grassroots volunteer effort to test this out. That's the only thing I've ever heard of that nature. Most of the other stuff is kind of done more in a laboratory setting, more controlled settings. And so again, what are all these wild mushrooms, the many different wild mushrooms? They all have different properties. Just like a tomato has 1,000 different cultivars, a given species of mushroom has many different what are called strains or different genetic expressions. And who's to say that one type of chanterelle or one strain of chanterelle or an oyster mushroom or something isn't much stronger at accumulating heavy metals than another? So basically what I'm saying is I don't have the easy answer, and maybe somebody out in the audience actually knows, the good handful of mushrooms. I don't have that off the top of my head, unfortunately. But the bigger caution is to be careful, and that they could be accumulating all kinds of metals, and not just radioactive metals. I mean, mushrooms accumulate all kinds of metals that are toxic to us. And it's just a risk that goes along with eating mushrooms. So you want to pick them in the cleanest areas as possible. But it's hard to say where the cesium is spread, and it's and whether or not that specific patch of mycelium has accessed an abundance of it, or if its mycelium is so far below ground that it's not really in contact with a lot of the cesium. There's just all these variables. So I mean, for myself, I harvest mushrooms. I basically just try not to think about it, and I will eat some of those plants like seaweed and things that'll help carry metals out of your body and try to help reduce the risk. But it is a risk. And that's just the world that we live in, unfortunately, because of these fallouts. I mean, you just can't make this reality go away.
brought with the Rhine and river flood. Where the bridge once stood and once run with blood, there came a man whose name was Life, and he took the earth to be his word. He cried for a son of Pirate. He searched the heavens, he searched the sea, till a son was born whose name was Death, and he charmed the sun which brought him love.
We are back with Peter McCOY of the Radical Mycology Project. My next question is a bit lighter than the topic of nuclear fallout. So, how can mushroom cultivation be built into a permaculture design? Like, commercial mushroom cultivators often have large investments and equipment. How can a homesteader grow her own mushrooms without a big investment?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the remediation thing is a big topic. And, while we were talking, I did just check online, and there are a couple good lists of fungi that are accumulators of metals. I just didn't have that memorized, so people can look that up. It's a pretty common list, and I think a question that's been popping up post-Fukushima.
Where is that list? Would you mind sharing?
Well, I found one on a website called healwithfood.org.
Okay.
I have an article that lists. And it's a pretty extensive list, and it includes a lot of very commonly harvested wild edible mushrooms. And so again, I mean, there's probably a huge variety in the testing, and it's a huge variable. It's a big thing about mycology, and it's a great answer to a lot of questions I get is it depends, because the fungi are so variable, and there's a lot that depends on environmental conditions. And again, going back to their strain and genetics really determines how they react in nature, how much medicine they produce, what their flavor is. All these things are so specific, not just between species, but between strains. So I'll leave that to the reader, or to the listener, sorry, to look up. But yeah, going back to the cultivation thing, I mean, that is, again, one of the underlying things behind the Radical Mycology project is trying to teach low-tech or cheaper, simpler ways of cultivating fungi. A lot of these systems have been developed, and approaches have been developed in the last 10, 20 years, largely perpetuated through the internet, where there's pretty great online communities and forums of people teaching each other and really pushing the limits and coming up with some pretty ridiculous at times, but pretty incredible and ingenious at other times methods of working with the fungi and understanding their basic needs and how they work, and just getting creative and thinking about that, and really going outside of the box of where traditional cultivation, large-scale farms, what you'll read in the technical manuals that are currently in the bookstores will tell you, there's so many different ways to go about cultivating fungi. It's kind of absurd. They are so complex on one end, but also very simple on the other, as far as the cultivating the decomposers go, which are the ones that we cultivate for food and medicine. So I just kind of want to preface that. A lot of people get this huge notion in their head that it's really difficult and takes a lot of money and equipment, like you're saying, and more that paradigm is shifting. And again, through Radical Mycology, we're trying to create awareness around that and to bring these skills to the people who can all use them. So that being said, in a permaculture system, I mean, permaculture is a concept of learning from nature and being resource efficient and just always trying to obtain a yield and stack functions. And there's a lot of different ways that we can just apply the principles of permaculture to mushroom cultivation and try to take that bigger picture approach. But essentially, just so the listener has a little bit of a background, all you're doing when you're cultivating mushrooms is, and when I say mushrooms, I mean the big fleshy things that we want to eat for food or maybe make some medicine out of. Those start out with a small piece of mycelium, which if you ever roll back a rotting log in the woods or something like that, you'll see some white stuff below the ground there, or the interface. That's the mycelium. That's really what the fungus is this network of fibers, these unicellular threads that travel through whatever the food source is or through the soil, digesting organic matter, fighting off competitors, interacting with trees and other plants, and doing all the things we've already talked about so far. So out of this network of mycelium, every fall, or depending on the mushroom, the different seasons, when the environmental conditions are right, it'll pop up a mushroom. The mycelium will kind of aggregate and accumulate and go through this magical transformation, turning into a mushroom above ground that we can pick and enjoy. So for cultivation, all you're doing is taking a small piece of that mycelium and mimicking what it does in nature by feeding it food, depending on the mushroom, maybe some compost or some wood-based food or paper products or coffee grounds or other urban or agricultural waste products. And it'll grow through that stuff, it'll digest it. And if you give it enough food and it develops enough of a nutritional base, kind of like a rootstock for a plant, it'll produce a big flush of mushrooms. So that's the basic concept. And how you can cultivate them is, like I was saying before, as far as your imagination can take you. So cultivating mushrooms for food is a large topic, so I'm not really going to go deeply into that. But what I can talk about to spark some creativity is thinking about how we can apply our mushroom installations into permaculture type settings. So we can cultivate them indoors. That's a really technical, a little bit more difficult than outdoors in a lot of ways, especially for the beginner. There's some leniency there. But I'll focus more on outdoor applications because that's where it gets really fun, because you're actually getting out into nature. So I was saying before that fungi are decomposers and they release CO2 as they decompose. And so what do plants breathe? They breathe in CO2. And so clearly there's a strong relationship between plants and fungi. And so an easy way to integrate fungi into existing food systems is to put mushroom beds into your greenhouse. And so mushroom beds can go into all the dark corners underneath your tables with your start trays, things like that. And they'll not only be generating heat, and if you have a sufficient amount, they can generate enough heat to extend the season or to begin the season a little bit earlier in the greenhouse by producing a lot of heat through decomposition. But they'll also be pumping out a ton of CO2 that'll feed the plants and help them grow bigger. And if you apply those beds, which are basically, like Paul Stamets was describing, inoculated wood chips that are covered with this mycelium that is decomposing the chips. If you apply that as your mulch layer over your beds, whether indoors or outdoors, you'll not only get all the benefits of a mulch, which again is reducing water use and keeping the soil temperature more mediated, but you're also pumping out this CO2 and pumping out mushrooms once in a while too, which is a great perk. And also there's been some companionings where it's been shown that certain mushrooms, for whatever reasons, either stimulate the microorganisms in the soil around the plant and help the plant grow, or do something to help stimulate the plant's roots itself. And so these fungi, even though they're above the soil, things that they're releasing through decomposition seem to be trickling down and stimulating the plant and helping it grow bigger and better and getting a higher yield. So that's a pretty incredible advantage right there. Really well-tested example of that is a mushroom called the elm oyster, or Hypsizygos ulmarius is the Latin name. And that pairs really well with all the brassicas. So that's a pretty easy one. That's a really easy mushroom to grow with some really easy plants to grow, and you'll boost your yield. Recently, a friend of mine made an amateur mycology discovery that's actually pretty profound, where she accidentally thought she had that same mushroom and paired it up with a aronia plant, which is related to blueberries, as well as her grape plants. And actually, she had a different mushroom, turns out, Foliota nemico, another commonly cultivated edible mushroom, and it boosted the growth of this blueberry relative and her grapevines incredibly. And nobody had ever done that before. So that just speaks to the potential of people experimenting and developing new companionings and learning more about this cutting edge field of permacultural plant fungal integration. So that's like a pretty simple installation application, but we can get a lot more complex and creative as far as stacking functions. And I'll just list a few without taking too much more time. But if people cultivate worms to make worm compost, they can eat the leftover mycelium when you grow the mushrooms on any number of agricultural waste products. So mushrooms can be grown on a lot of different common plant products, agricultural waste products. By and large, you can pretty much grow a fungus off of it and thereby increase your yield of this organic matter. Once the mushrooms have fruited, you can feed that You can put that in your compost pile. You can use it as mulch as it is, or you can feed it to your worms as a high protein source for the worms. Worms pump out a bunch of castings, and then you can even use those castings later on to feed the mushroom and, kind of complete the cycle. Indoors, you can do a lot of interesting things, or more kind of, for lack of a better word, utilitarian kind of uses or ways to use fungi in other ways beyond food and medicine. Is people are researching ways to insulate natural buildings with them, and that's a really fascinating concept. They're basically on a microscopic level, kind of like really high quality fiberglass or something, where there's lots of tiny little air pockets, but you can actually have them grow to form and fill up every little cavity, so you get incredible soundproofing and insulation from this natural thing grown off of waste products. We've already talked a lot about the mycorrhizal fungi. So again, these ones live in the soil, and you can probably a lot of any of your listeners that are farmers or permaculturalists or gardeners have seen mycorrhizal fungi spores at the store. These things do help your plants. Some products are better than others. Some have a higher concentration of spores, so I tell people to look into that. There's just so many things. So, those are really basic concepts, but then going larger than that, going into the restoration and redesign of environment, or if you're doing whole landscaping systems, if you're doing water catchment systems and keyline systems, putting mushroom beds pretty much everywhere along the way where there's excess water spilling. The fungi need lots of water. And so harvest some of that or store it in the fungus for a while, and you'll get food out of it. And they can grow in all the dark areas of your property where you can't grow food. And there are some mushrooms that are incredibly easy to grow. They'll grow off pretty much anything you throw at them. It's kind of unbelievable. And you don't have to be clean. You don't have to be sanitary with some of these species. So that's like a really kind of all over the map idea of just a few of the ways to integrate fungi that are some of the easiest. As far as getting that going, the equipment, there's many different grades to how intense a person needs to get about setting up a mushroom cultivation space. We have a page on the Radical Mycology website where I walk through some of the most basic, simplest, straightforward methods that I know of to create large quantities of mycelium really cheap, really easily at home with minimal experience, minimal precautions, and minimal investment. Really, really simple. I think it's a pretty good approach, and definitely a good one for the beginner. Of course, there's a lot of ways to expand from there. So I'll just let people check that out on the website. We have a zine, a pamphlet that accompanies it for free, where you can read along and watch the video and see exactly how it's all done. And then from there, it scales up quite significantly from all intermediate stages to having a small backyard little production facility to a medium farm to, of course, large scale farms that you read about in the books. But I always recommend people just start small and play with the fungus and just kind of learn from them. That's definitely the best way you'll grow as a cultivator, is just through practice. And of course, we'll be covering a lot of this in the Radical Mycology book, a lot of these skills and concepts as well.
Congratulations on your new book. How and when can we get a copy? And would you tell us a bit about your tour across America?
Yeah, the Radical Mycology book is set to be coming out. We're shooting for October, but it might be as late as November. So people can look at the radicalmycology.com website for updates and get on our email list if they're really excited about that. We'll be getting set up with pre-orders on a website pretty soon, so the reader can check that out. But yeah, this fall we'll be going on a tour around North America, covering a lot of topics on the book and presenting sample chapters so people can see what that looks like, and offering the pre-orders there as well. We'll be traveling pretty much throughout North America, all across the US and southern Canada from mid-August to mid-November. And the details are on the radicalmycology.com website as well. The book's a big part of that tour, but really the bigger picture is we ultimately want to promote Radical Mycology as a project and teach a lot of the skills that we offer through the book, but do it in person. And also to promote the Radical Mycology Convergence, which is happening in October.
Where is the Radical Mycology Convergence being held this year? And would you give us a brief description of what the experience is like?
Oh, definitely. The Radical Mycology Convergence, this will be the third time that we've done it. It's going to be outside of Chicago in northern Illinois in this town called Orangeville, October 9th through the 13th. this year. And it's a multiple day donation-based, volunteer-run skill share and gathering, all on the topics of mushroom cultivation and the many different applications that we've been talking about and ways to work with the fungi, and also just a larger context of building not only a community around fungi and sort of this radical mycology ethos that I've been sort of touching on, and sort of building an intentional community, if you will, that supports and hopefully promotes this concept beyond the convergence and beyond the Radical Mycology collective members to the attendees who can share it with their people and their towns around the world to really get these skills out there. So we focus a lot on different things to just build community and have fun, and everybody camps out on the land and food is provided. And then we also just have discussions on tangential topics, again, going into social organizing as a whole and how fungi can influence that, and thinking on bigger picture metaphoric levels, deeper discussions on what we can learn from fungi, from the environment, from each other, from working together, all these sort of bigger picture topics that go just beyond nitty gritty, what can I do with a mushroom type of mycology. We also have, again, sort of parallel movement workshops, people from outside of the mycological world teaching related skills. So we're trying to build bridges. And yeah, it's going to be an incredible year. I'm really excited. The last one was better than the first. And since the second one, this whole project has grown quite significantly. Our mycelial network of co-collaborators and myco-conspirators across the country and around the world has really grown. And so I think the turnout is just going to be incredible. And some of the workshops I'm really, really excited about. We're really trying to step up the game and teach better skills and make things more accessible for people. So we're going to try really hard to leave everybody really prepared, or at least, pretty dang comfortable with their understanding of what was presented, so that they can actually act on these things to improve their life of their friends and family, and hopefully the life of other organisms in the world.
I was fortunate enough to attend the Convergence in Port Townsend, Washington last year, and I was blown away. I would definitely recommend it to any of our audience members who want to be inspired by all things mushrooms. So my last question for you is about other books, articles, blogs. If you want to drop a few names of people to write down and read and become closer allies with.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say go to the Radical Mycology site, radicalmycology.com, and we have a page with a bunch of links, and that includes a lot of organizations and just different good websites and resources, and kind of the best of the resources that are out there as far as online resources. Another person that I definitely recommend people looking up if they're interested in the bioremediation aspect is my friend Lila Darwish. She's based out of Canada, and she wrote a book called Earth Repair. That's kind of the only really grassroots bioremediation book that's available, and I think it's a really accessible book. And she definitely does a great job of getting down all the nitty-gritty skills of plant, mushroom, and bacterial remediation strategies, but also puts it into a realistic context and balances it with a bit more inspiration than I kind of provided today, but also keeps it real and shows you what it's really like and what you're up against. So I think that's a really good introduction to the bioremediation concept, and a really incredible book. But otherwise, that's the unfortunate thing about mycology. It really is limited for most people to the few books that are out there. And researching for the Radical Mycology book, I read pretty much all of them, and they all kind of say the same thing in a lot of ways. The technical books get into different, sort of different details here and there, but the underlying themes and the same approaches to mycology are sort of the same across the board. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of people out there that are doing really outside the box different approaches to mycology. But there are a few, and we definitely link them on our website. So I encourage people to check that out. But otherwise, a good place to just get started in mycology is joining your local mycological society. And I definitely don't want to turn people off from that. They're a great resource, incredibly knowledgeable people, a lot of elders to learn from. Going back to what our society needs, I think it's a huge component, is learning from our ancestors and from our elders, and respecting tradition and where mycologies come from, and definitely not writing that off. So definitely want to encourage people to check that out and get their feet wet, just going on some forays and hunts and learning basic taxonomy and identification. And some of those clubs include cultivation, subgroups. And, if people want to learn more, there are some books out there. Paul Stamets' Mycelium Running is arguably the most accessible one and kind of the most engaging one that's currently on the shelves. I do know a person named Trad Cotter out of South Carolina is about to come out with a book. I'm really excited for that. It's going to be on cultivation and remediation as well. And he's an incredibly brilliant person, so I'm excited to see what he has to say. And another good event is the Telluride Mushroom Festival. And I'll be presenting there with some of the other Radical Mycology folks, along with many other presenters. And that's actually probably one of the better resources for finding a lot of other teachers on mycology that are taking different approaches. I definitely don't want to act like Radical Mycology is the only group taking a novel approach. We're doing it in our own way. But there's a lot of people that present at Telluride, and that's a pretty good assortment of creative types and eclectic mycologists presenting on all kinds of topics. It's a little bit more expensive, so that's a limiting factor for a lot of people. So we do offer the Radical Mycology convergence to parallel Telluride, sort of, and yeah, I'd say those are some starting places for sure. And I'll just plug myself and say that I do teach cultivation courses here and there, and I'm currently on hiatus as I'm working on the book, but there's a sign-up sheet or email sign-up on the website where people can get on the email list for that, and I can update as workshops are scheduled.
Thank you, Peter, for coming on today and shedding some light on the incredible world of mushrooms.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm just so excited to be on the show and to share this with the world.
Sweet smell of pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind.
Thank you for listening to another edition of Unlearn and Rewild. Our first musical selection today was David Sylvian singing A Fire in the Forest, followed by Bert Jansch singing Brought with the Rain. Our theme song, Like a River, is by Kate Wolf. And thank you to our producer, March Young.